tell me I'm an idiot and all this other stuff. And they don't seem to have any feeling that they should use any manners or anything when they express themselves. So I know why we don't talk about these things in public. But you know what? We still need to talk about them. Okay? And sometimes you got to have thick skin and deal with a little shrapnel and try to get down to the bottom of things. That's what Truth Quest is all about, isn't it? And so, spirituality gets locked up in the cage. People don't talk to each other. People might have great ideas and great inspirations. Nobody finds out about it because they're afraid to talk about it. People have bizarre, silly ideas that would never fly in a logical discussion, but they never, ever find out they're wrong because they never talk to anybody about it and find out. I mean, look, we all have our limitations of perspective, and we all have our blind spots. And usually other people can see our blind spots a whole lot better than we can. I know that's true of me. If somebody tells you they have the truth, they're not being arrogant. They're either right or they're sadly deceived. But you can't put down somebody for being deceived, and you can't fault somebody for being right. So the real challenge, discerning the difference. Now, number 6. The Bible is out of date, inaccurate, overrated. People in the 21st century are way too smart for that. Now, at first blush, that doesn't sound like an organized religion kind of thing to say. Until you start investigating, you'll find out there's an awful lot of churches and an awful lot of denominations and different people. They'll tell you exactly that. In hushed tones. They'll pretend that they kind of buy into this, but they really don't. Well, think about this. Isn't it easier, if you were a religious leader, wouldn't it be easier to keep people under your thumb and get them to follow your agenda if there was no external standard of reference that you could hold them accountable to? If somebody rejects any standard of reference and they just say, well, this is what I come, my children, this is what I think you should do, and he's the standard, and it's just his opinion, isn't it easy for him to do anything he wants to? When I was growing up, my pastor would say, if I ever start teaching stuff that's wrong and it's not in the Bible, and I start distorting the Bible, you come and you confront me, and if I don't listen to you, you throw me out. That's how I think a church should operate. You hold the leaders to a standard. You make them walk their talk. How do you know what the talk is? You read it. Mortimer Adler, one of the greatest literary scholars, he spent decades researching a book called The Great Ideas. And in the research of this book, he and his staff read every major piece of literature that's ever been written in Western history. And he distilled it down to 102 ideas that are important in Western culture. And in the very first chapter of this book, he talks about the 20th century delusion. And the 20th century delusion is the fact that modern people think that we're more enlightened, more wise, and more sophisticated than people that ever lived before us. Now, do we have more technology? Sure we do. Do we have more medicine? Sure we do. Do we have transportation and all this kind of stuff? Sure we do. Are we wiser? Now, I learned something about this when I was in college. I took this class called English Authors Before 1800. So this was like from Chaucer to Shakespeare to William or Samuel Johnson and some of these different people, I was astonished at how sharp some of these people were. They wrestled with tough questions, and they got down to it. They were wise. Okay? Our 20th century, 21st century culture, no wiser than any other time. Okay? We've got just as many dysfunctions as people has ever had. We just have more sophisticated dysfunctions. It used to be, if you wanted to watch a fight, you'd have to go to your neighbor's house and look through the window. Now you just turn on Jerry Springer. Right? Book of Proverbs in the Bible was written 3,000 years ago. The book of Proverbs has saved my butt more times than anything. A soft answer diffuses anger, but harsh words stir up evil. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. The fool hates to be corrected by his father, but a wise son listens to advice. I think what's so clever about Proverbs is he takes these incredible, profound truths and crunches them down to these little sentences with 2 parts. A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. 2 ways to go. 2 ways to have this next phone conversation we're about to have. Which way do you want it? You get to decide. Solomon lays it out for you. 31 chapters. Great book to read 1 chapter a day for a month. In my professional life, I spend most of my time with entrepreneurs and business people. And in the entrepreneurial business world, people talk about books like Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, or they talk about How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, and all. You guys have seen books like this, right? Proverbs is head and shoulders above all that stuff. There is no contest. Not even close. If I had to take one business book to a desert island, I'd take Proverbs. It's brilliant. 3,000 years old. Now, Solomon, who wrote Proverbs, he said there's nothing new under the sun. And some people kind of snicker at that. He doesn't mean there's no new technologies or no new innovations. That's not what he means. What he means is there's no new situations. There's no new situations. There's no new ethical and moral quandaries. It's all the same stuff. I think it was Chesterton who said, news is old things happening to new people. Another thing, people ask me stuff like, okay, is the Bible a translation of a translation of a translation? Is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and nobody knows what the original was? Was this the game where you whisper something to somebody in the room and it goes around, it comes back, you whispered to him, go to McDonald's, and it comes back to you, the butterfly flew out the window or something, right? Well, for a long time, the oldest existing copies of the Old Testament were dated 1100 AD. And when most of the events it describes are 1500 BC. So if skeptics wanted to say that it was all written, all these prophecies about Jesus and stuff, if they wanted to say they were written long after the fact, in some degree it was hard to argue with that until a boy threw a rock into a cave in the Qumran Valley and they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they found fragments of most of the books of the Old Testament dating to before Christ. Most of them somewhere between 100 and 200 BC. And the text in those scrolls was, for all practical purposes, identical to the stuff they had from 1100. It had been preserved pretty much exactly. Okay? Now this is remarkable. And this proved, well, you know what? They didn't make this up in 500 or some such thing. And there's prophecies. I'll give you an example of one, or a couple. Isaiah described the crucifixion of Jesus with remarkable precision 700 years before it happened. Daniel, 550 BC, predicted the rise and fall of the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman empires in sequence with remarkable details. 550 BC. Okay? It's really astonishing when you go look this up. Now, New Testament. We got 5,000 ancient manuscripts dating from the 2nd, 3rd centuries of the New Testament. Some of them date back to around, give or take, somewhere around 100 AD. We have writings of early church fathers, people like Polycarp, Ignatius, Origen, Clement, early church fathers. And it all converges. It all tells a common story. I think the only reason that people really doubt this stuff is it talks about miracles. It talks about people rising from the dead. It talks about blind men being raised. It talks about lame men walking. So like, resurrection of Jesus, was it a conspiracy? Chuck Colson was a guy who got arrested in the Watergate scandals. And here's what he said. He says, Watergate was a conspiracy to cover up perpetuated by the closest aides to the President of the United States. One of them, John Dean, testified against Nixon to save his own butt only 2 weeks after informing the President about what was really going on. 2 weeks. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks, and then everybody else jumped ship to save themselves. And what's more, nobody's life was at stake. Okay? Now, let's say that the disciples went into the tomb, never mind the soldiers and all that stuff, never mind the big rock. They went into the tomb, and they got Jesus' body out, they cut it into 1,000 pieces, and they fed it to the fish in the Sea of Galilee. And then they went around and said, Jesus rose from the dead. Hey, everybody, follow us. Okay, now let's say they did that. Now, if you read history, these guys were stoned to death, sawed in two, crucified upside down, beheaded. Like 11 of the 12 disciples were all martyred that way. Now, don't you figure that if they pulled this off, that somebody would have said, okay, don't chop my head off, I'll tell you what really happened. I mean, if somebody's about to chop your head off, are you going to keep defending your silly story? What do you have to gain at that point? One thing that is really hard to argue with historically is that the early church and the early disciples were convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. Somehow or another, they got convinced that happened. And they started the greatest mass movement in the history of civilization. Line number 7. If God was really so powerful and good, He wouldn't allow so much evil and suffering to go on. Now, this is not an organized religion question. This is an everybody question. My wife and I, once a year or so, we try to, we take turns. We got little kids at home. We can't both go. But one of us goes to the Jagged Edge every year, as much as we can. So, been to places like Sao Paulo, Brazil.